Hello, dear one, and welcome back to Christian Divine Feminine, a podcast about faith, healing, and learning to see God not just as Father, but also as Mother. This is the third episode in our trauma series. If you've journeyed with us through the first two episodes, you'll know we've explored how trauma is stored in the body and how feminine-centered spirituality can support deep, embodied healing. Today we take another step, one that's a little more hidden, but just as sacred. We're talking about family intergenerational trauma, the pain we didn't choose, but carry, the patterns passed down through families, the silence that echoes across generations, and how a feminine-centered faith can gently interrupt the cycle. In this episode, we'll explore what intergenerational trauma is and how it's passed down, how it uniquely impacts women, especially those in nurturing roles, how the wounds of our mothers and grandmothers live in our bodies, and how reclaiming feminine spirituality can help us become cycle breakers with tenderness, not blame. And just before we begin, I want to gently remind you that I'm not a psychologist, psychiatrist, or counselor. I'm simply someone who has walked this path and found healing through the sacred lens of the divine feminine. This is not medical advice. It's a compassionate offering from my heart to yours. And if you're struggling right now, maybe feeling heavy, confused, or tender, please know this. You are loved, you are held, and you will be okay. Intergenerational trauma is the trauma we inherit, not through DNA alone, but through silence, survival patterns, and emotional imprinting. It's the fear that lives in a family line long after the event is over. The mistrust passed down through glances and gestures. The anxiety that has no clear origin, but feels like it's always been there. Science now supports what many Indigenous spiritual and feminine wisdom traditions have always known. Trauma can be transmitted, not only through what happens to us, but through what happened to those who came before us. If your grandmother lived through war or domestic violence, if your mother wasn't allowed to express her emotions, if the women before you had to suppress their needs to survive, you may find yourself carrying their unspoken grief, or their perfectionism, or their fear of rest, or their inability to trust. And it can be confusing, because you might look at your own life and think, but I'm safe now. Why do I still feel this way? And the answer might be because you're carrying someone else's pain in your nervous system. So how does intergenerational trauma actually develop? It begins with an event, or often a series of events. A war, a natural disaster, a violent relationship, a migration, a childhood in poverty, a death that no one spoke of. Sometimes it begins in the most personal of places, within the home, especially when a parent lives with an untreated or unsupported mental health condition. Growing up with a parent who struggled with anxiety, depression, addiction, or emotional dysregulation can leave lasting imprints, even if they loved you deeply, because children are wired to adapt. And when safety is inconsistent or the emotional atmosphere is heavy, the child often learns to monitor the parent instead of resting in their care. You might grow up feeling hyper-responsible, or like your needs are a burden. You may have learned to become invisible to keep the peace, or to achieve and perform, hoping it would regulate the chaos around you. And all of this can be passed down, not just in behavior, but in how we relate to our own emotions, our sense of worth, and our understanding of love. One of the most overlooked but deeply significant and interesting sources of inherited trauma is the immigrant experience. So many of us carry family histories shaped by migration, leaving behind homeland, culture, language, and identity in search of survival, safety, or opportunity. And while there may have been pride and strength in that journey, there was often trauma too. The trauma of leaving the familiar, the ache of being othered, the pressure to fit in, the urgency to work twice as hard to be seen as enough, the burden of carrying a culture you're scared to lose, while trying to belong in one that never fully welcomes you. For women especially, this can manifest in complex ways. Our mothers or grandmothers may have clung tightly to tradition, not out of stubbornness, but out of fear of erasure. Or they may have abandoned parts of themselves to blend in, modelling disconnection as a form of protection. We might find ourselves still carrying that tension, the guilt of feeling too much or not enough, the pressure to succeed to make their sacrifices worth it, the confusion of not knowing where we truly belong, the inherited need to prove our right to exist, contribute, or thrive. This is trauma too, even when it's wrapped in achievement, resilience, or silence. And the thing about intergenerational trauma is that it doesn't need to be spoken to be passed down. It lives in the atmosphere of a home. It shapes the way we are loved, disciplined, praised, or criticized. It shows up in what is celebrated and what is shamed. So when we find ourselves carrying fear, perfectionism, or deep restlessness and can't trace it to anything in our own lives, we're likely holding stories that began before we were born. But here's the grace. If trauma can be passed down, so can healing. And we get to be part of that turning. We get to name what was never named. We get to hold the ache that no one else had the time or safety to hold. And in doing so, we get to offer something different, not just for ourselves, but for the generations to come. Women have often been the emotional anchors in families. We are socialized to care, to nurture, to hold things together. But in doing so, we're also taught to suppress, to minimize our needs, to carry what others cannot. This means trauma often gets stored, not only in our nervous systems, but in our sense of identity. We become the peacemakers, the perfectionists, the protectors. But underneath those roles, there is often pain, unexpressed grief, generations of silence. And here's something important. Many women are trying to heal while still mothering others, still caring, still holding. This is why a feminine approach to trauma is so needed. One that isn't about striving, fixing, or becoming your best self, but about softening, receiving, letting yourself be held. That's the difference between masculine and feminine healing paths. The masculine approach tends to say, push through, improve, overcome. The feminine says, pause, listen, let yourself be loved here. And when we bring that softness into our healing, we begin to unwind not just our own pain, but the pain of generations. One of the most powerful things we can do on this journey is to look back with tenderness. Because when we begin to explore the pain of those who came before us, mothers and fathers, grandmothers and grandfathers, something softens. Maybe your father was taught that emotions were weakness, and so he buried his tenderness. Maybe your mother had no one to model emotional safety, and so she passed on the silence she was raised in. Maybe your grandparents survived war, poverty, or migration, and believed that survival meant suppressing softness. When we begin to understand this, we stop expecting them to have given us what they were never taught to receive. This doesn't excuse harm, but it creates room. Room to grieve, room to forgive, room to reclaim what was missing, not just for ourselves, but for the whole family line. Feminine faith offers us the grace to say, I see now. And because I see, I choose differently. This is the beginning of freedom. The beginning of healing not just for ourselves, but for generations to come. A key part of this healing journey is addressing shame, because trauma doesn't just hurt, it shames. It says, you should have been stronger. You should have known better. You should just get over it. Women especially carry this weight. We internalize messages that we're too emotional, too sensitive, too needy. We try to be everything, competent, calm, in control, and underneath, we're aching. This is where the myth of the hysterical woman lingers. You've probably heard of it in some capacity, and we touched on it briefly in the last podcast. She's too emotional. She needs to calm down. She's too sensitive. She's so dramatic. It's a historical wound anchored in patriarchal systems that pathologized women's emotional expression. In ancient Greece, hysteria was believed to be caused by a wandering womb. In the 19th century, it was a medical diagnosis for everything from grief to passion to intuition. Women were institutionalized for being too much, too loud, too sad, too wise. So we learned to fight her, to fight that part of ourselves that cried out. But the truth is, she wasn't hysterical. She was in pain. She was trying to communicate. The work now is not to silence her, but to listen, to welcome the emotion, to validate the story behind the feeling, to say, I believe you. You make sense. You're allowed to take up space. When we do that, we begin to dissolve shame. And what's left in its place? Dignity, self-compassion, and the freedom to heal. So how do we actually begin this healing? Not through force, not through fixing, but through sacred, simple presence. Start with stillness, not the polished kind, but the kind where you sit, hand over your heart and whisper, I'm here. Let the Divine Mother hold you in that moment. Imagine her presence, warm, soft, enveloping, not asking you to change, but simply to be. Journaling is a beautiful way to begin noticing the stories you've inherited. Try this prompt. What beliefs about safety, love, or worth have I carried that may not be mine? Let the answers come gently. Movement helps too. Not formal exercise, but embodied movement. Stretching, swaying, placing your feet on the ground, letting your body speak. You might try breath work, singing, or lying on the earth. Anything that helps you return to your body, not as a problem to solve, but as a sacred vessel. And community. We cannot do this alone. Whether it's a spiritual group, a therapist, or a trusted friend, we heal faster when we are witnessed. Feminine faith reminds us, healing isn't about becoming perfect. It's about becoming whole. And wholeness means welcoming all parts of you, even the ones your ancestors had to hide. When you allow yourself to be broken, imperfect, and to feel held by a loving mother, something beautiful begins to happen. You start to soften, to breathe deeper, to trust your emotions instead of fearing them. You realize that your worth was never tied to your strength, but to your sacredness. You stop performing and start becoming who you really are beneath the layers. The feminine face of God does not demand you hold it all together. She simply wants you to be, to rest, to weep, to heal, to be reborn. And in that safety, real transformation unfolds. If you're here listening, you're already doing the work. You're already the one in the family line who is brave enough to pause, to feel, to name what was once unspeakable. You are the healing. The divine doesn't ask you to do this perfectly, only to be present, only to let love reach the places shame has silenced. This is sacred work, and you are not alone in it. I'll leave you with this blessing. May the wounds you carry become the places light pours through. May the stories you inherited find release in your breath. May your body feel safe, your heart feel seen, and your spirit feel held. You're not too much. You're not too broken. You're not too late. You are the one your ancestors dreamed of, and you are held always in the arms of the Divine Mother. Thank you for being here. In episode 4, we discussed the mother wound and reclaiming the sacred feminine within. Until next time, gentle one, go gently, go slowly, go in love.